In 2024, Vladimir Putin issued an ultimatum to Ukraine. It must fully withdraw from the Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson regions.
Эти условия очень простые. Украинские войска должны быть полностью выведены из Донецкой, Луганской народных республик, Херсонской и Запорожской областей. Причем, обращаю внимание, именно со всей территории этих регионов в пределах их административных границ, которые существовали на момент их вхождения в Украину.
The Kremlin's problem is that the Russian army hasn't fully seized these regions, which means Moscow's task isn't just to occupy as much territory as possible before peace negotiations begin, but to demonstrate to Kiev and the Ukrainian people that their armed forces cannot hold these lands. According to the Kremlin's plan, this should make President Zelensky more willing to negotiate. The Ukrainian military is preparing for future negotiations in its own way by clinging to its foothold in Russia's Kursk region. Zelensky has called this operation a tool of diplomacy. However, despite the Ukrainian army's efforts, the territory it controls here continues to shrink.
І ми не збираємось там жити, ми не збираємось захоплювати їх території, нас це не цікавить. Нас цікавить повернення наших територій. І якщо при закінченні війни, при дипломатичних кроках, або при сьогоднішніх тактичних військових кроках на поле бою ця операція буде мати впливовий ефект, ми будемо користатися цим. Так.
In the Donetsk region, Russian forces have been advancing slowly on several fronts for more than a year. The overall goal is to capture the part of the region still controlled by Ukraine. Over the past year, the Russian army has concentrated its main efforts in the southern part of the Donetsk region, around the cities of Pokrovsk and Kurakhove, which are significant both logistically and politically. If successful, the Russian offensive will likely shift northward to the Kramatorsk and Slavyansk metropolitan area, where the Donetsk region's Ukraine-controlled administration is located. After months of fighting, the Russian army captured Kurakhove on December 31st. Ukrainian troops have left the city, but they remain under threat of encirclement. The Russian army is close to encircling the Pokrovsk metropolitan area from the west and east. After several months of gruesome fighting, Russian forces have also effectively captured the Toretsk metropolitan area. Additionally, Russian forces have entered the center of another key city, Chasiv Yar. To the north, in the Kharkiv region, they have crossed the Oskil River and established a foothold on its western bank. Only in the Kursk region has the Ukrainian military managed to prevent the Russian army from reaching key points in its defenses. At the start of the year, Russian forces in the Kursk region launched a new phase of their offensive against the Ukrainian-held city of Sudzha. Russia's primary goal remains the roads to the south and southwest of Sudzha, which are critical for supplying Ukrainian troops in the Kursk region. Upon launching the offensive, the Russian army immediately encountered Ukrainian counterattacks, and Russia's North Korean allies are involved in the intense fighting that has ensued. In most cases, Ukrainian troops have retreated, leaving the battlefield to Russian forces. However, the Russian army has likely not achieved all of its objectives. The target of the current Russian offensive is the small town of Malaya Lukhnya, northwest of Sudzha. This is a key position in Ukraine's defenses. Ukrainian forces in Malaya Lukhnya threaten from the north above the western flank of the Russian advance on Sudzha. Previously, these Ukrainian forces hindered Russian troops from retaking the small town of Novaya Ivanovka. Now that Novaya Ivanovka is under Russian control, Ukrainian counterattacks from Malaya Lukhnya continue to impede the Russian advance toward Sudzha. In the fall, Russian forces attacked Malaya Lukhnya from the north, but Ukrainian troops repelled these attacks. In December, with support from North Korean forces, the Russian army managed to reach the outskirts of Malaya Lukhnya from the west while also advancing toward the town from the east. In the west, Russian and North Korean troops occupied the town of Kuruklenka and reached Nikolaevka on the outskirts of Malaya Lukhnya. They advanced until stopped by Ukrainian counterattacks. To the northeast, a Russian attack coincided with the Ukrainian counterattack toward the small village of Berdyan. Ukrainian forces advanced several kilometers that day but suffered losses and retreated. Russian units captured the neighboring town of Ruskoye Porechnoye. Despite the challenges in advancing on Malaya Lukhnya, Russian forces progressed farther west to Lyadnidovo, though they still have a long way to go to Sudzha's western outskirts. South of Sudzha, Russian forces that captured the town of Kurakhove in December are trying to build on their success, but the Pokrovsk River has slowed their western advance toward Ukrainian troops' main supply line, the Sumy-Sudzha highway. It seems this is why Russian military commanders decided to redirect their offensive towards Sudzha's southern outskirts. In early January, Russian units captured part of Makhnovka, a town just 2 kilometers from Sudzha. However, Ukrainian defenses at the Smerdytsa River have thwarted further advances. In mid-January, Russian forces completed their encirclement of Velika Novosilka. Russian troops also captured the towns of Niskuchная and Vremivka located to the southwest, cutting off the last supply routes for Ukrainian defenses in the area. The remaining Ukrainian forces in the area are likely receiving only minimal supplies delivered by heavy octocopter drones. The Ukrainian military garrison could evacuate Velika Novosilka by wading across the Mokry Yali River, northwest of the town, but the group would lose all its heavy equipment in the process. The riverbanks are marshlands, making it impossible to get vehicles out without reliable crossings. The Russian plan to take Kurakhove, an essential communications node in the southern Donbas, aimed to encircle the city with strikes from the north and south, with an attack from the east apparently designated to a supporting role. To counter the threat of encirclement, the Ukrainian military redeployed forces to its flanks along defensive lines on the Volcha and Suhy Yakli rivers. They managed to slow the Russian advance, retaining control of the only route from the city toward the west, the Donetsk-Zaporizhia highway. But the road, exposed to fire from both flanks, proved inadequate to supply the Ukrainian forces defending Kurakhove. On December 31st, Ukrainian units were forced out of their last position in the western part of the city, the industrial zone and Kurakhove thermal power plant. Despite withdrawing from Kurakhove, Ukrainian troops remain under threat of encirclement west of the city. Russian forces continue their westward advance along the banks of the Suhy Yakli and Volcha rivers. The Ukrainian army still controls the Donetsk-Zaporizhia road west of Kurakhove, but Russian forces threaten to cut off this highway too. 12 kilometers from Kurakhove, near the villages of Konstantinopol and Andreevka, the Suhy Yakli River flows into the Volcha. Russian strikes from the north and south target the point where they converge. Russian forces have reached the outskirts of Andreevka from the north and approached Constantinople from the south. Ukrainian forces continue retreating westward. Whether they can establish a new defensive line or retreat to the boundary of the Dnipropetrovsk region remains unclear. Russian forces reached the eastern outskirts of Pokrovsk in the summer of 2024. Contrary to the Ukrainian military's expectations, the main Russian thrust then shifted southward toward Kurakhove. Some Ukrainian forces held defensive positions on Pokrovsk outskirts, while others withdrew to the Kurakhove reservoir. This created a gap in Ukrainian defenses between Pokrovsk and Kurakhove, which Meduza has covered in previous reports on the war. In December, Russian forces exploited this weak point, breaking through Ukrainian defenses 10 kilometers deep and reaching the Solyolnaya River, just a few kilometers south of Pokrovsk. Now, despite Ukrainian counterattacks, Russian forces are advancing westward across this gap over a broad front. Simultaneously, Russian army units are trying to encircle Pokrovsk from the southwest, which could mark the start of an operation to capture the city. Ukrainian forces tried to halt the enemy advance along the Solyolnaya River, but Russian forces managed to cross the river at several points. Ukrainian troops spent weeks trying to dislodge Russian forces from their bridgehead near the town of Shevchenka on the Solyolnaya River. However, Russian units bypassed them on other parts of the front. Russian units have captured the town of Kotlinya and cut the railway line west of Pokrovsk. 5 kilometers comprising fields and tree lines now separate them from the main road connecting Pokrovsk to the Dnipropetrovsk region. Russian advance units are now within 3 to 4 kilometers of Pokrovsk's southern outskirts and 3 kilometers from Udachny to the west. Ukraine's largest metallurgical coal mine is located near this town. The main thrust of the Russian offensive is aimed squarely at Udachny. While Ukrainian troops fight to repel the enemy's advance on Pokrovsk from the south, Russian forces east of the city have stepped up their operations. After months of calm, Russian troops launched an offensive in the Volzhvezhenka area toward the Pokrovsk-Konstantinovka highway. Russian units advanced several kilometers and reached the road. Whether they secured their position there remains unknown. This group could eventually advance on Konstantinovka. Together with forces attacking Toretsk and Chasiv Yar, they might move north toward the Slavyansk-Kramatorsk metropolitan area, the largest urban area in the Donbas still under Ukrainian control. Another option is to bypass Pokrovsk and its satellite city of Mirnograd from the north and advance toward the Dnipro. Ukraine's military currently lacks the forces needed to address all these threats. The fight for Toretsk and nearby town sites began in July when the Russian army redeployed troops from the Pokrovsk front to this area. It didn't take long for Ukraine to lose the towns south of Toretsk, but reserves were then concentrated in Toretsk, halting the Russian advance for months in the city's center and western outskirts. In December and January, however, Ukraine's defenses in central Toretsk were finally broken. Russian forces captured the area, rapidly moving through low-rise residential areas to the city's northern border. The last pockets of Ukrainian resistance are confined to the mining facilities and their slag heaps. At the same time, Russian forces are advancing north along the Donetsk-Slavyansk Railway on Toretsk's western outskirts. The goal of this offensive is to reach Konstantinovka from the south. A Russian grouping from Chasiv Yar, north of Toretsk, may soon join this effort. Meanwhile, after months of fighting, Russian forces broke through the very center of Chasiv Yar. They began fighting for positions in the buildings of the city's refractory plant, situated on an elevated point overlooking the entire region, from Bakhmut in the east to Konstantinovka in the west. The initial attempt to take the plant failed, and fighting lasted more than a month as the Ukrainian military kept supplies flowing to the fortified area's defenders until Russian forces advancing from the north reached their rear defenses. Both Ukrainian and Russian sources report that this advance led to the collapse of Ukraine's defenses in the city's center. Russian forces continue advancing on a broad front toward the Oskil River, though several Russian units have attacked without good coordination. North of Kupiansk, Russian forces crossed the river and established a stable bridgehead on its western bank. From there, Russian troops will likely move south toward the western part of Kupiansk, but they're currently mired in fighting in the northern part of the bridgehead, near Dvarechnya. South of Kupiansk, Russian forces reached the Oskil River in the fall. They are trying to push along the river both toward Kupiansk and in the opposite direction, toward Kharkiv. Further south, Russian units are advancing on multiple fronts. However, they have not reached the river and are unlikely to reach it anytime soon. The objective of all these offensives is to reach Liman, where the Oskil flows into the Seversky Donetsk River, and eventually to reach the Kramatorsk-Slavyansk metropolitan area. However, given the current balance of forces, achieving this seems unrealistic. The main question is, will Russia have enough forces to achieve its ambitious plans in 2025? According to quarterly budget reports, the number of contract soldiers Russia recruited to fight in Ukraine decreased in 2024 compared to 2023. Whereas all last year, the Russian army was recruiting at least 900 contract soldiers per day, in the third quarter of 2024, the daily number of new recruits had dropped to between 500 and 600. And this is despite the fact that federal bonus payments for signing army contracts have doubled since August 1st, 2024. According to estimates by Meduza and Mediazona, in the summer of 2024, an average of 200 to 250 Russian troops were killed in Ukraine every day. And total irreparable losses, taking into account the severely wounded, totaled 600 to 750 soldiers daily. There's a link to a story about this in the description of this video. In all likelihood, the number of Russian troops in Ukraine will not only stop growing, but may even begin to decrease. This could force the Kremlin to consider a new round of mobilization. And what about Ukraine? No one knows. The massive wave of volunteers dried up back in 2022, and mobilization has been ongoing since the full-scale war began. Ukrainian military experts predicted that when the new mobilization law came into force in May 2024, the Ukrainian Armed Forces would pull in 900 to 1,000 new recruits per day. However, this hasn't changed the dynamics on the front line. Russian troops are continuing to advance. We also know that the Ukrainian Armed Forces are forming new brigades in the rear, including one that's being trained and armed in France for a new counteroffensive in 2025. Western allies are urging Kiev to lower Ukraine's draft age from 25 to 18. This would make an additional 430,000 people eligible for mobilization. But of course, not all of them would end up in the army. For more on the Ukrainian army's recruitment numbers, see the link in the description of this video.